The air in the mining colony was thick with dust and despair. Workers moved like shadows, heads low, hands blistered from endless labor. Among them was a young woman with pale blue skin and white hair. She was known only as Silence. No one knew her real name, and she never spoke. Her frail appearance made her invisible to most, but not to Ethan. Ethan was a human engineer, hired to maintain the colony's aging machinery. Though he was not a slave, he was bound to his contract, unable to leave until his term ended. He hated the place, the harsh overseers, the cries of workers, and the suffocating air of oppression. Yet, something about Silence caught his attention. She moved differently than the others. There was a grace in her steps, even when carrying heavy loads. Her eyes, though often downcast, held a spark of defiance. One day, Ethan watched her from a distance as she carried a load of mining tools. A worker nearby tripped, and a large metal beam tipped over, about to crush the man. Before anyone could react, Silence moved. She darted forward with impossible speed, grabbing the man and pulling him to safety. The beam crashed to the ground, sending a cloud of dust into the air. Silence stepped back quickly, blending into the crowd as if nothing had happened. Ethan's heart raced. That wasn't normal. No one else seemed to notice or care, but Ethan couldn't stop thinking about it. He started watching her more closely, noticing the way she avoided drawing attention to herself. She never spoke, never argued, and never looked directly at the overseers. But in her quiet moments, when she thought no one was looking, her posture changed. She stood tall, her movements sharp and deliberate, like someone trained for something far greater than carrying tools. That night, Ethan sat in his small quarters, the memory of her swift rescue replaying in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that Silence was hiding something. He decided to approach her, though he wasn't sure how. Talking to the slaves was frowned upon, and the overseers didn't hesitate to punish anyone they saw as disruptive. But Ethan wasn't the type to ignore his instincts. The next day, he found her in the tool storage room, organizing equipment. The space was dimly lit, with only the hum of machinery breaking the silence. Ethan cleared his throat. "Hey," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned slowly, her pale blue eyes meeting his for a brief moment before she looked away. "I saw what you did yesterday," he continued. "You saved that guy. That was incredible." Silence said nothing, her hands tightening around the tool she held. Ethan noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way she glanced at the door, as if expecting someone. The wasteland was quiet now, but the silence felt heavy. Ethan and Silence moved cautiously, their steps crunching against the cracked ground. The small group of workers had scattered into the vast desert, each carrying the hope of freedom. Silence had given them a chance, but doubt gnawed at her. Had she done enough? Would they survive on their own? Ethan glanced at her as they climbed a rocky hill. She was focused, her pale blue skin glowing softly under the setting sun. Her expression was unreadable, but Ethan could sense the weight she carried. "We'll make it," he said, breaking the silence. Silence didn't respond immediately. She reached the top of the hill and scanned the horizon. In the distance, the faint outline of the abandoned outpost came into view. "We're not safe yet," she said finally. "Drones can be recalled, and Krovar won't give up easily." Ethan sighed, wiping sweat from his brow. "You don't always have to act so strong, you know. It's okay to admit you're tired." Silence turned to him, her eyes narrowing. "Tired doesn't matter. Weakness gets people killed." Her words were sharp, but Ethan saw the pain behind them. He didn't press her, knowing she wasn't ready to let her guard down. Instead, he focused on the path ahead. The outpost was closer now, its rusted walls blending into the rocky landscape. When they finally reached the entrance, Silence pushed open the creaking metal door. The inside was dark and musty, but it offered shelter. Ethan found an old console and fiddled with it until the lights flickered on. The space was small, with a few broken chairs and scattered debris, but it was enough. Silence sat against the wall, her head resting on her knees. Ethan rummaged through his pack and handed her a water flask. "Drink," he said. "You need it." She hesitated, then took it, drinking in small sips. Ethan sat beside her, leaning against the cold metal wall. "You've been quiet," he said gently. "What's going on in that head of yours?" Silence didn't look at him. "I told you before, I was a warrior. My people trusted me to protect them, and I failed." Ethan frowned. "You didn't fail. You were betrayed." "I was betrayed because I trusted the wrong person," she said, her voice low. "And because of that, my people were slaughtered, and I was sold like a piece of cargo. Every day since then, I've thought about what I could have done differently." Ethan was quiet for a moment, letting her words sink in. "Carrying that guilt isn't going to change the past," he said softly. "But you've already started making things right. You gave those workers a chance to escape. You're fighting back." Silence shook her head. "It's not enough. I don't know if they'll survive out there. And even if we make it, Crovar and his kind will still hunt us." Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch firm but comforting. "You can't control everything. What matters is that you're trying. You're giving people hope, and that's more than most would do." Silence finally looked at him, her pale blue eyes filled with uncertainty. "Why do you care so much? You barely know me." Ethan smiled faintly. "Maybe I don't know everything about you, but I know enough. You're strong, brave, and you've been through more than anyone should. You're worth fighting for." For the first time, Silence's hardened expression softened. She looked away, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." The moment was brief, but it felt significant. Silence wasn't used to relying on others, but Ethan's presence was beginning to feel less like a burden and more like a source of strength. The quiet was interrupted by a distant rumble. Silence stood instantly, her instincts kicking in. "Something's coming," she said, moving to the window. In the distance, a cloud of dust rose against the twilight sky. Ethan joined her, his heart sinking. "Crovar's forces." "Probably," she replied. "They won't stop until we're dead or captured." Ethan grabbed a wrench from the floor, his jaw tightening. "Then we make our stand here." Silence nodded, her warrior spirit reigniting. "If this is where we fight to win." As the dust cloud grew closer, they prepared for the inevitable. Together, they were stronger. Together, they would face whatever came next. Ethan's heart raced as he sprinted through the broken halls of the outpost, each footstep echoing in the silence that followed the chaos outside. The communication system was down, but the fight was far from over. Silence had given them the chance they needed, and now it was up to him to finish what they had started. As he reached the back door, he could hear the distant sounds of gunfire. Silence was still out there, holding the line, but the enemy was closing in. He paused for a moment, pressing his back against the cold metal wall of the outpost. He could feel the weight of the situation. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about everything they had fought for. He pulled the door open, wincing at the creak of the old hinges. The wasteland outside was bathed in the dim light of the setting sun, the ground still scared by the recent explosion. Ethan's eyes scanned the horizon, his mind calculating. Silence would need more time. He couldn't let her down now. He pushed forward, weaving between the broken walls of the outpost, heading for a small hill on the outskirts. He had seen a set of old vehicles earlier in their escape, a potential escape route if he could make it back to them. They might not be fast, but they were something. The alternative was a direct confrontation, and that was not something they could win, not with Crovar's forces still out there. As he made his way toward the vehicles, Ethan's mind kept returning to Silence. She had trusted him, fought beside him. And now she was out there risking everything. He couldn't let her sacrifice herself for nothing. Suddenly, his communicator beeped, breaking his thoughts. It was Silence. Her voice crackled through the small device. "I'm done here," she said, her voice calm but strained. "Get to the vehicles. I'm bringing them in." Ethan froze. Wait. Silence. What do you mean? There are too many of them. I said, I'm done here. She interrupted, her tone leaving no room for argument. We don't have much time. Get to the vehicles now. Ethan didn't hesitate. He turned and ran toward the old vehicles, his legs burning with each stride. He knew there was no time to argue with her. She was already in motion, taking the fight to the enemy. By the time Ethan reached the vehicles, Silence was already on her way. She was moving fast, her silhouette cutting across the horizon, her figure a symbol of the warrior she had once been. But it wasn't just her strength or skill that kept her moving. It was her will to survive, to rebuild, to make things right. Ethan knew now that they were both on the same path, and there was no turning back. As Silence approached the vehicles, the sound of enemy vehicles grew louder. They were nearly out of time. Ethan jumped into the driver's seat of one of the rusted old transport trucks and fired up the engine. The vehicle sputtered, but to Ethan's relief, it roared to life. Move! Silence shouted from the rear as she jumped into the back of the truck, her weapon raised and ready. She didn't need to say more. Ethan slammed the pedal to the floor, and the truck lurched forward, its tires kicking up dust as they sped toward the wasteland's edge. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter, but Ethan knew they weren't safe yet. He kept his foot on the gas, pushing the old truck to its limit. Silence, sitting behind him, kept watch, her sharp eyes scanning for any signs of danger. She was more than a warrior. She was a protector, and she wasn't about to let anyone get close to them. Hours passed as they drove further into the wasteland, leaving the outpost and the fight behind them. The landscape stretched endlessly before them, barren but full of promise. The road was harsh, and the truck groaned under the weight of the journey, but they were moving forward. They were free. Ethan glanced at Silence, her face lit by the fading light of the sun. She had fought harder than anyone, carried the weight of her past on her shoulders, and now, for the first time in a long while, she looked at peace. She had made it through, and so had they. Where are we headed? Ethan asked, his voice softer now, as the adrenaline began to wear off. Silence smiled faintly. Anywhere but there, she said. And when we stop, we start again. Together. Ethan nodded, his heart swelling with something he couldn't quite put into words. They had both been broken, but now they were whole again. And whatever came next, they would face it side by side. As the truck bounced across the cracked earth, the horizon stretched wide and infinite. The past was behind them, and a new beginning awaited. Together, they would rebuild. Together, they would survive. The distant rumble of approaching vehicles grew louder, and the sky darkened with the dust cloud stirred up by the oncoming forces. Silence stood near the entrance of the old outpost, her body tense, her eyes scanning the horizon. Ethan joined her, his hand tightly gripping a wrench, his other hand on the makeshift baton he had taken from a guard. They're getting closer, Ethan said, his voice low but steady. We have to prepare. Silence nodded but didn't move. She was calculating. Every inch of her body screamed readiness. But beneath her warrior instinct was something else. A deep, quiet pain. This fight wasn't just about survival. It was about redemption. She couldn't afford to fail again, not after everything she had lost. How many do you think they have? Ethan asked, his gaze flicking between her and the horizon. At least 24, Silence replied. Enough to overwhelm us if we don't act fast. Ethan's heart raced. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded by nothing but empty land and broken walls. The outpost was barely holding together, and their chances of survival seemed slim. But they didn't have a choice. If they didn't fight, they'd be captured. If they fought, they might die. Okay, what's the plan? Ethan asked. Silence turned to him, her eyes hard but not without a flicker of something else. Trust. She was relying on him, even though she had every reason not to. We'll make it look like we're trapped, she said, her voice calm. I'll take the front, draw them in. You get to the back door and disable the communication system. If we can cut off their contact with reinforcements, we'll have a chance." Ethan nodded. He wasn't a fighter, but he knew enough about technology to make the plan work. "Got it. And what about you?" "I'll hold them off as long as I can. When you're ready, you make a run for it. I'll cover you." Ethan's stomach tightened. "You can't do this alone. Let me help." Silence shook her head. "You don't have the training. You'll only get in the way." Ethan opened his mouth to argue but stopped when he saw the look in her eyes. She was already preparing herself for the worst, and nothing he said would change her mind. She had made her choice. "Just be ready," she said, her voice softer now. "You'll know when to go." The sounds of the enemy forces grew louder, closer. Ethan glanced around the room one last time. The outpost was filled with old equipment, some of it functional, some of it useless. He quickly spotted the control panel in a corner and moved toward it, his hands working quickly to disable the communication systems. Every second felt like an eternity. Outside, Silence stood alone, her figure silhouetted against the setting sun. She had positioned herself just outside the entrance, hidden behind a crumbling wall. She knew the moment they saw her, they'd charge. But she also knew she had to hold them off long enough for Ethan to finish his task. And then, like clockwork, the first set of guards appeared over the ridge, their weapons drawn. Silence stepped out from her cover, her movements fluid and precise. She didn't hesitate, didn't flinch. She was a warrior again, and this was her fight. The first two guards rushed toward her, guns aimed. Silence sidestepped one, using his own momentum to send him crashing into the ground. She grabbed his weapon mid-swing and used it to disarm the second guard. As he fell, she delivered a swift blow to the back of his head, knocking him unconscious. More guards followed, but Silence moved with an ease that was almost unnatural. She was faster, stronger than they had anticipated, her body flowing with the grace of a predator. The enemy was relentless, but Silence was determined. Every strike, every move she made was calculated. She fought like the general she once was, and it showed. But as she fought, she felt the familiar sting of exhaustion creeping in. Her muscles burned, and the weight of her past pressed down on her. She couldn't keep this up forever. She needed to hold on just a little longer. Inside, Ethan's fingers flew across the control panel, his heart racing. The enemy was closing in on Silence, and he could hear the sound of their weapons firing. He glanced over his shoulder, but he couldn't afford to look away. He had to finish what he started. With a final press of a button, the communication system shut down, and the lights in the outpost flickered. Ethan exhaled in relief, but the battle wasn't over. He turned and bolted toward the back door, ready to make his move. Silence had bought them time. Now it was up to Ethan to finish this. But as he ran, he looked back and saw the lone figure of Silence, still holding her ground against the advancing guards. And for a brief moment, he knew, whatever happened next, they would survive this together. Ethan couldn't shake the conversation he had with Silence. Her words lingered in his mind. The betrayal of her people, her life as a warrior, and the danger she faced if her true identity was discovered. He saw the courage she tried to hide and felt a growing determination to help her. The next day, Ethan found himself watching the overseers more closely. He paid attention to their routines, the times they patrolled, and the weak points in their security. The mining colony operated like a machine, but every machine had its flaws. Ethan was determined to find them. Silence, however, kept her distance. She avoided him in the yard and barely acknowledged him during work hours. Ethan understood. Trust didn't come easily, especially not in a place where betrayal could mean death. Later that evening, Ethan saw her again in the tool storage room. This time, she didn't seem surprised to see him. Instead, she looked at him with a mixture of caution and curiosity. "You shouldn't keep coming here," Silence said, her voice low. "If they catch us talking, it won't end well for either of us." Ethan closed the door behind him and leaned against the wall. "I've been watching the overseers," he said, ignoring her warning. There are gaps in their patrols, weak spots in the fences. If we're careful, we can get out of here." Silence stared at him, her pale blue eyes narrowing. "We?" Ethan nodded. "I'm not leaving without you, and if we can free some of the others along the way, even better." Silence crossed her arms, skepticism etched on her face. "You're risking everything for people you don't even know." "Why?" Ethan shrugged. "Because it's the right thing to do, and because you don't deserve to die here." Silence's gaze softened, but only for a moment. "Do you even know what you're saying? Escaping this place isn't just dangerous. It's nearly impossible. They have drones, guards, and trackers. If we're caught, they'll kill us. Then we make sure we're not caught." Ethan said, his voice steady. "I know how to disable the trackers. I can hack into their systems and create a distraction, but I can't do it alone." Silence looked at him for a long time, her expression unreadable. Finally, she sighed. "If we're going to do this, we need a real plan, and we need to move carefully." Ethan smiled faintly. "That's why I came to you. You're a warrior, remember? You know strategy better than anyone." For the first time, a hint of a smile tugged at Silence's lips. "Flattery won't keep us alive, but it's a start." Over the next few days, Ethan and Silence worked in secret. They met in the storage room late at night, whispering plans and sketching maps of the colony. Silence shared what she had observed about the guards' routines and the colony's layout. Ethan explained how he could manipulate the security systems, pointing out weak points they could exploit. Their plan slowly took shape. Ethan would hack into the colony's mainframe to disable the electric fences and shut down the surveillance drones. At the same time, Silence would lead a small group of trusted workers through a hidden tunnel near the mines. The tunnel was unstable and rarely used, but it was their best chance of slipping past the guards. Silence insisted on vetting the workers they included in the escape. "We can't trust just anyone," she said. "One wrong person could betray us." Ethan agreed, though it made him uneasy. The more people they brought into the plan, the greater the risk. But he knew they couldn't leave everyone behind. As the days passed, tension in the colony grew. The overseers seemed more aggressive, as if they sensed something was amiss. Ethan and Silence worked quickly, knowing their window of opportunity was closing. One night, as they finalized their plan, Silence looked at Ethan and said, "If this goes wrong, you need to save yourself. Don't risk your life for me." Ethan shook his head. "That's not an option. We're in this together." Silence didn't reply, but the look in her eyes told Ethan she understood. They had become allies, bound by a shared determination to defy the cruelty around them. And together, they would fight for their freedom. Silence stood in the middle of the square, surrounded by guards, her fists clenched and her eyes burning with defiance. The crowd of workers watched in stunned silence, unable to believe what they were seeing. This quiet, frail woman had just taken down an armed overseer with her bare hands. Crovar's face twisted with rage. "Kill her," he bellowed, pointing a clawed finger at Silence. The guards hesitated for a moment, clearly unnerved by her sudden display of strength. But then they moved in, weapons raised. Silence was ready. With a speed and precision that left the onlookers breathless, she ducked under the first guard's swing, grabbing his wrist and twisting it until he dropped his weapon. In one fluid motion, she flipped him to the ground, rendering him unconscious. Another guard charged, but Silence sidestepped, landing a sharp kick to his knee, sending him sprawling. Ethan, still bound and kneeling nearby, stared in awe. This wasn't just self-defense. This was skill, training, and instinct honed to perfection. Silence wasn't fighting like someone desperate to survive. She was fighting like a warrior. The square erupted into chaos. The workers, emboldened by Silence's resistance, began to murmur and shift. A few even stepped forward, ready to join the fight, but the sight of the heavily armed overseers kept most of them rooted in fear. Ethan's mind raced. He couldn't just sit there and watch. He struggled against his bindings, twisting and pulling until the ropes cut into his wrists. "Come on," he muttered to himself, gritting his teeth. He had to help her. Meanwhile, Silence was holding her own against the guards, but she knew she couldn't keep this up forever. Her strength and skill gave her an edge, but the sheer number of enemies would eventually overwhelm her. She needed a plan, and she needed Ethan. Her eyes darted to him, still struggling against his ropes. "Ethan," she shouted, dodging a swing from a guard's baton. "The control panel. Disable the alarm." Ethan followed her gaze to the large console at the edge of the square. If he could reach it, he could shut down the colony's defenses, and maybe even give them a chance to escape. But first, he had to get free. Summoning all his strength, Ethan yanked hard against the ropes one last time. With a sharp snap, they broke. He didn't waste a second. He scrambled to his feet and darted toward the console, weaving through the chaos in the square. Overseers shouted at him, but they were too distracted by Silence to stop him. Crover noticed Ethan's movement and roared in fury. "Stop that human!" he barked, sending a pair of guards after him. But Silence intercepted them, her movements a blur as she took them down with a series of quick, brutal strikes. Ethan reached the console and quickly began working on the controls. His hands moved fast, overriding the security protocols he had studied during his time in the colony. Lights flickered, and the sirens that had been blaring suddenly went silent. The electric fences surrounding the colony powered down, and the drones hovering overhead dropped to the ground with a series of metallic thuds. The workers in the square began to cheer, their fear giving way to hope. For the first time, they saw a chance to fight back. Some of them grabbed tools and broken weapons, joining Silence in her battle against the remaining guards. Crovar, seeing the tide turn, bared his teeth and stepped forward, drawing a large serrated blade. "You think you can defy me?" he snarled, his voice dripping with menace. "I'll make an example of you." Silence turned to face him, her breathing heavy, but her resolve unshaken. "You've ruled through fear for too long," she said, her voice steady. "That ends today." The two squared off, the tension in the air thick enough to cut. Ethan, now free and armed with a stolen baton, rushed to Silence's side. "You don't have to do this alone," he said, his voice firm. Silence glanced at him and gave a small nod. Together, they faced Crovar, ready to fight. The odds were still against them, but for the first time, it felt like they had a chance. The warrior in Silence had been unleashed, and with Ethan by her side, she was determined to win. The air in the colony felt heavier than usual. Ethan and Silence had worked tirelessly to prepare their escape, but tension gnawed at them both. Every glance from an overseer, every shadow in the corner, felt like a threat. The plan was nearly ready, yet the risks loomed larger with each passing day. That night, Ethan and Silence gathered their small group of trusted workers in the dimly lit storage room. There were 6 of them, each handpicked by Silence for their loyalty and desperation to escape. Ethan laid out the details one last time, his voice low but firm. "When the power goes out, you move fast," he said. "Silence will lead you through the tunnel. I'll stay back to finish disabling the security systems. Once the drones are down, I'll join you." The workers nodded, their eyes filled with both hope and fear. They trusted Silence, and by extension, Ethan. For the first time in years, they felt a glimmer of freedom within reach. As the group dispersed, Ethan caught Silence's gaze. "We're almost there," he said quietly. Silence nodded, though her expression remained tense. "Almost isn't enough. Stay sharp." The next day, everything started to unravel. Ethan was in the control room, pretending to repair a broken console, when he noticed the overseers moving in unusual patterns. They were gathering in groups, their voices hushed but urgent. Ethan's stomach churned. Something was wrong. Back in the yard, Silence sensed it too. The overseers were more aggressive, shoving workers and barking orders. She kept her head down, but her instincts screamed danger. One of their own had betrayed them. That evening, as Ethan prepared to disable the colony's power grid, the door to his small workshop burst open. Overseers stormed in, weapons drawn. Ethan barely had time to react before they seized him, shoving him to the ground. "You thought we wouldn't find out," one of them sneered. "You're not as clever as you think, human." Ethan struggled, but the overseer's grip was iron-tight. Panic surged through him, not for himself, but for Silence and the others. If they had been discovered too, everything was over. Meanwhile, in the worker barracks, Silence was confronted by Crovar, the ruthless alien leader of the colony. Crovar towered over her, his sharp teeth glinting in the dim light. "You've been busy, haven't you?" he growled. Silence kept her face blank, but her mind raced. Someone had betrayed them. One of the workers they trusted had sold them out in exchange for promises of better treatment or freedom. It didn't matter who. It only mattered that the plan was falling apart. Crovar grabbed her by the arm, his claws digging into her skin. "You thought you could escape. Pathetic. You're not even worth the effort of punishment." Silence didn't respond, her warrior training keeping her calm. She glanced around the room, noting the guards' positions, the distance to the door. Fighting now would be suicide, but she wouldn't go down without a plan. Hours later, Ethan and Silence were dragged into the colony's central square, bound and surrounded by armed overseers. The workers were forced to watch, their faces pale with fear. Crovar stepped forward, his voice booming. "This is what happens to those who defy us," he declared. "Let this be a lesson to all of you." Ethan looked at Silence, guilt and regret etched into his face. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Silence met his gaze, her expression unreadable. But in her eyes, Ethan saw something unexpected: determination. As Crovar raised his weapon to strike, Silence moved. With a sudden burst of strength, she snapped her bindings, her movements so swift that the guards barely had time to react. She lunged at the nearest overseer, disarming him with a single blow. Chaos erupted as workers began to scream and scatter. Ethan watched in awe as Silence fought with precision and ferocity. She wasn't just surviving, she was reclaiming her power. But the odds were against her. Crovar barked orders, and reinforcements closed in. "Run!" Silence shouted to Ethan, her voice cutting through the chaos. But Ethan didn't run. Not yet. He knew their fight wasn't over, and he wasn't leaving her behind. The plan had failed, but the war for their freedom had just begun. Days turned into weeks, but Ethan couldn't get Silence out of his mind. Every day, he found himself watching her from a distance, noticing more details. The way she moved, how she avoided the overseers, and how she quietly helped others without drawing attention. She was different, stronger, smarter. Ethan didn't know her story, but he knew she didn't belong in this miserable place. One evening, after his shift ended, Ethan lingered near the supply area. He had seen Silence go in earlier, and he wanted to try talking to her again. He had brought some extra rations he had saved. Small, but it was all he could offer. The storage room was dim, lit only by a single flickering light. Silence was there, crouched in the corner, her back to the door. She didn't notice him at first. "I brought something for you," Ethan said softly, careful not to startle her. Silence turned sharply, her eyes narrowing. For a moment, he thought she might yell, but she quickly relaxed when she recognized him. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice low but firm. Ethan stepped closer, holding out the small package. "Take it. You look like you haven't eaten properly in days." Silence hesitated, her gaze flicking between Ethan and the door. Finally, she reached out and took the rations, her fingers brushing his for a brief moment. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice still guarded. Ethan leaned against the wall, keeping his voice low. "Because I can't stand seeing this place grind people down. And because I know you're not like the others." Silence froze, her pale blue eyes locking onto his. "What do you think you know about me?" she asked, her tone sharp. "I know you're hiding something," Ethan replied. "I saw what you did in the yard that day. You're faster, stronger. You're trained, aren't you?" For a long moment, Silence didn't respond. Her expression was unreadable, her body tense as if ready to bolt. Then, with a deep breath, she spoke. "If you know what's good for you, you'll stop asking questions." Ethan shook his head. "I can't do that. Look, I'm not here to expose you. I want to help." Silence stared at him, her expression softening slightly. "Help," she repeated, almost laughing. "You can't even help yourself. You're stuck here, just like the rest of us." "Maybe," Ethan admitted, "but I still have choices, and right now I'm choosing to help you." Silence studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether he was sincere. Finally, she sighed. "If I tell you anything, you can't repeat it. Not to anyone." Ethan nodded. "You have my word." She glanced around the room, ensuring they were alone. Then she leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't always like this. My people, we were warriors, skilled, proud, but we were betrayed. I was captured and sold into slavery. If the overseers knew who I really was, they wouldn't keep me alive." Ethan's heart sank as he listened. He had suspected she was hiding something, but this was more than he had imagined. "A warrior?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "You fought in battles." Silence nodded. "I led them. My people trusted me, and I failed them. That's why I keep my head down now. If I fight, if I draw attention, they'll find me." Ethan's mind raced. The quiet, seemingly frail woman he had been watching was actually a trained leader, someone who had fought for her people. "You didn't fail them," he said firmly. "You're still alive. That means you still have a chance to make things right." Silence shook her head. "It's not that simple. You don't know what they're capable of." "Maybe not," Ethan replied. "But I know what you're capable of. And if you decide to fight back, you won't have to do it alone." Silence looked at him, her expression unreadable. For the first time, Ethan thought he saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. She didn't say anything, but the way she held the rations told him she was starting to trust him. As Ethan left the storage room, he knew he had crossed a line. Helping Silence wasn't just about her anymore. It was about standing up to the cruelty around them. And for the first time, he felt like he was doing something that mattered. The colony descended into chaos as workers, emboldened by Silence's defiance, clashed with their overseers. Ethan and Silence stood together, facing Crovar, who gripped his serrated blade with deadly intent. "You've already lost," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the tension. Crovar sneered. "You think shutting down a few systems makes you heroes. I'll make sure you die slowly." With a roar, Crovar lunged at them. Silence moved first, stepping in front of Ethan and blocking Crovar's blade with a metal rod she had taken from a fallen guard. Sparks flew as their weapons clashed. Crovar was strong, but Silence was faster. Her movements were precise, each strike calculated to weaken her opponent. Ethan circled around, looking for an opening. He wasn't a fighter, but he wouldn't stand idle. Spotting a loose cable on the ground, he grabbed it and swung it toward Crovar's legs. The alien leader stumbled, giving Silence the moment she needed. With a swift kick, she knocked the blade from Crovar's hand and drove her makeshift weapon into his shoulder. Crovar roared in pain, retreating as blood oozed from the wound. Before Crovar could recover, a deafening explosion rocked the square. Silence turned, her eyes widening as a plume of smoke rose near the colony gates. One of the workers had detonated a makeshift explosive, creating a breach in the wall. "That's our way out," Ethan shouted. Silence nodded, grabbing his arm. "Move." The two sprinted toward the breach, weaving through the chaos. Workers followed, many carrying tools and weapons they had scavenged during the uprising. Guards tried to block their path, but the workers overwhelmed them with sheer numbers. Outside the colony walls, the wasteland stretched endlessly in every direction. The ground was dry and cracked, the air heavy with heat. Silence led the way, her warrior instincts kicking in as she scanned the terrain for threats. "We can't stay exposed for long," she said, her voice sharp. "They'll send reinforcements." Ethan glanced back at the colony. Alarms blared, and Crovar's remaining guards were regrouping. "How far is the next safe point?" Silence hesitated. "There's an old outpost about 3 miles west. It's abandoned, but it'll give us cover." The group moved quickly, their breaths labored as they pushed through the harsh environment. The heat was oppressive, but no one dared slow down. Every sound, every gust of wind or distant crack, felt like a potential threat. As they approached a rocky ridge, Silence held up her hand, signaling the group to stop. "Wait," she whispered, crouching low. Her sharp eyes scanned the horizon. "What is it?" Ethan asked, crouching beside her. "Drones," she said grimly. "They've already sent them after us." Ethan's stomach sank. The colony's drones were fast, armed, and relentless. If they were spotted, it would be over. "What do we do?" Silence's mind raced. "We split up. The drones can only track one target at a time. If we create multiple paths, we might confuse them." The workers exchanged nervous glances, but they trusted Silence. She quickly divided them into smaller groups, assigning each a direction. Ethan stayed by her side. "You're with me," she said firmly. "I need you alive." Ethan gave a weak smile. "Good to know." The groups scattered, each heading in a different direction. Silence and Ethan moved toward the ridge, using the rocky terrain for cover. The sound of drones buzzed closer, the faint whir of their engines sending chills down their spines. Silence stopped suddenly, grabbing Ethan's arm. "Hide here," she ordered, pointing to a crevice between 2 large rocks. "I'll draw them away." "No," Ethan protested. "We stay together." "You're no use to me dead," she snapped, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Trust me." Reluctantly, Ethan obeyed, crouching low in the crevice as Silence darted out into the open. The drones immediately locked onto her, their lights flashing as they swooped down. Silence ran with purpose, leading them away from the ridge. Ethan's heart pounded as he watched her disappear into the distance. Minutes felt like hours, the silence around him almost unbearable. Then suddenly, the buzzing sound faded. Silence returned moments later, breathing hard but unharmed. "They're gone," she said, helping Ethan to his feet. "But we need to keep moving." Together, they pressed on, their bond stronger than ever. They had survived the first hurdle, but the wasteland held more dangers, and their fight for freedom was far from over.